Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to video 1 out of hopefully many to come. Well, I figured I'd start out with talking about something that's always interested me, the weirder side of football plays, on the offensive end that is, and more specifically, one formation that automatically comes to the mind of many when discussing that topic, the Wildcat. Because you know when the Wildcat is busted out, the team is either really desperate and it's going to be a crazy gain, or a terrible loss, and either way, it's fun to watch. So I love it as a result. So we're going to get into a bit of the history of the formation. Along with that, how it's been implemented, and just generally what it is to go along with that. And without further ado, I won't keep you waiting. Roll the intro.
I don't really have a good intro right now, but on this channel I like to talk sports.
So the term Wildcat itself is an offensive play where the ball is not snapped to the designated quarterback, but another player lined up in the quarterback position. And most of the time it's a running back or a wide receiver, but it is not impossible to see a tight end or fullback in that role if they're very athletic. And a lot of Wildcat plays also have unbalanced lines, where 3 or more offensive linemen are lined up on one side of the ball to gain a numbers advantage in the run game. And most Wildcat plays work out of the shotgun formation, and as such are most commonly used in very spread-oriented offenses. What makes the Wildcat successful is usually matchups. One, you already have a player at the quarterback position that is more adept at running the ball and taking hits than the quarterback, or rather, the team is more willing to have them get hit than the quarterback. And two, in most defensive formations, there's not automatically a defender lined up to guard whoever is at that quarterback spot, and there was some exceptions, but most of the time that's the rule, which means there is one less defender guarding the dude running the ball, or, well, passing the ball, but we're going to get into that later. So that's how the Wildcat mainly works, as a matchup disadvantage, making sure that your guy is opposing less guys in the run game and then working towards that. And then of course there's new wrinkles that can be added to that, which is the aforementioned passing out of the Wildcat. If defenses have seen the formation enough, and most have, they can find a way to shut down the run fairly effectively, and that's where passing the ball came into play. Of course, it keeps defenses honest when it comes to defending against the Wildcat, but it's also, not a great primary method of attacking with the Wildcat, because it's a player that doesn't have experience playing quarterback, passing. You see where the problem lies. Most of the time, the Wildcat is very high risk, high reward. I believe all of us have seen that throughout the years, and all of us have known that, but it's worth repeating. This is usually used only in those special circumstances where big plays are needed, a bit of trickery is needed on 4th down or whatnot, and you go to the Wildcat just to see what would happen. And a lot of times I've noticed that teams that don't have great quarterback play run the ball with the Wildcat a lot, or pass it with the Wildcat. Most recently, just last year, the Steelers ran the most Wildcat I'd seen out of the entire NFL last season, and think about it. Their quarterbacks at the time were Mason Rudolph and Duck Hodges for most of the year, so they figured, screw it, why not throw in Jalen Samuels, a running back with experience in the formation, and hope for the best. And so they did. Their offense wasn't good, but it was at least interesting. Most teams use the Wildcat sparingly, as its biggest weapon on the field is not just the mismatches or the lack of defenders, but surprise. And it will always be a surprise, because it's a trick play and a trick formation. But yeah, that's how the Wildcat is implemented in some forms today. Now let's get into a bit of the history of it. Now the Wildcat actually has a very long history, because it starts with some of the oldest formations in football, the single wing and the wing T. Those ideas of pre-snap motions that are prevalent before many Wildcat plays, and many Wildcat plays just looking the same to start with, that was started under wing T offenses way back in the day. There are still wing T offenses today, but most of them are at the high school level. But that's neither here nor there. That's another video. The single wing formation also does not have the quarterback lined up under center. The ball would be directly snapped to the running back, or if you've ever seen the footage of those plays from the 30s where the quarterback has to run and grab the ball as it is snapped and then take off with it, that's another thing that was prevalent in the single wing. And then they figured it would be easier to just have the quarterback receive the ball instead. And another possible origin of the Wildcat that is very interesting is six-man football. It was first developed in 1934 and is played mostly in very rural parts of Texas. The player who receives the snap in six-man football cannot run past the line of scrimmage at all. And that would lead to the trend of the ball being snapped to the wide receiver instead, so they could at least move with it. The wide receiver would then lateral it to the quarterback, and the play would run as normal because of it. In college football, the Wildcat would get a major start with Alabama in 1993 with quarterback/wide receiver David Deuce Palmer. Palmer was 5'9" and a $165 soaking wet, but he was one of the very first Wildcat quarterbacks on record at a major college program. The formation was not called the Wildcat yet, but the terminology didn't matter. Everyone knew what was coming when Palmer was lined up under center, but few could actually stop it. Palmer was also Alabama's first ever 1,000-yard receiver who also had 60 catches in a season, and he did so in the very conservative, run-heavy offense of one Gene Stallings as their head coach. Palmer was also a punt and kick returner in his time in Tuscaloosa, and would go on to the NFL and play 7 seasons, all for the Vikings. The Wildcat would see its first big explosion in college football in 1997 with Kansas State. Under head coach Bill Snyder and their new offensive coordinator Ron Hudson, they utilized the Wildcat incredibly effectively with quarterback Michael Bishop. They would go 11-1 that season, 7-1 in the Big 12, and would win the Fiesta Bowl to go along with it. The next year they would do the same thing, essentially. They would go 11-2, 8-0 in the Big 12, but they didn't get a bowl game, shockingly. And the thing is, they were number 3 in the country and still didn't get a bowl game after that. And that would lead to the creation of the Kansas State rule, where the number 3 team in college football is guaranteed a bowl game that season. The offense was incredibly successful. Bishop would run for 1,300 yards in the course of 3 seasons, and 748 yards in 1998 alone. The success of the Wildcat at Kansas State would have a major impact on college football, and in fact have a major impact on one very young head coach named Urban Meyer, who was trying to incorporate a spread option offense at Bowling Green in that year. This is where the Wildcat truly got its name. Because of Kansas State athletics, their mascot is the Wildcat. Simple as that. And it was most commonly utilized by Kansas State, and they were very successful with it, hence Wildcat. Simple as that. However, another school up in Washington utilizing the name Wildcats, LA Center High, would also use the formation a lot. And in fact, their head coach, Hugh Wyatt, would publish an article in Scholastic Coach and Athletic Director explaining how his offense, with 2 wing players under center alternating taking the snap, was effective. You know, like the Wildcat. Yeah, I know that's terrible, but it's my video. Over the next few years, the Wildcat would grow in popularity in college football, mainly utilized by teams that had a very, very athletic player that could also be dangerous as a quarterback, mainly with Steve Spurrier at South Carolina with the offensive weapon that was Savell Newton, Urban Meyer at Bowling Green with quarterback Josh Harris. But one school stood above all others when the Wildcat was at its peak in the late aughts, and that was, of course, Arkansas, with offensive coordinator Gus Malzahn in 2006 and David Lee in 2007. Arkansas was uniquely built to run the Wildcat. They had one of the best 3-headed monsters in college football, and arguably college football history, with their running backs Darren McFadden, Peyton Hillis, and Felix Jones. McFadden was the quarterback most of the time in their Wildcat formations, as he had played quarterback in high school as well. And he was also very, very well built, could run over a lot of people, was very fast, and could throw because of the aforementioned quarterbacking in high school. And the Arkansas Razorbacks used it to great success. In 2006, the Wildcat was on top of the football world because of McFadden and his incredible day versus LSU. McFadden had 238 yards rushing and 3 touchdowns, and also threw for a touchdown in a 50-48 overtime win over the Tigers. The Wildcat was on top, and it seemed unstoppable. However, the Wildcat at that point would be phasing out of college football. That was really its peak in 2006. It would be more and more relegated to just a trick play formation from then on out. The major exception being a few teams that have run it and had success, those being the Pitt Panthers with LaShawn McCoy and LaRod Stevens-Howling in their backfield, and Villanova, in fact. They won the 2009 FCS championship by utilizing the Wildcat heavily, with wide receiver Matt Scherzer running as a makeshift QB in the season. However, that would sort of fade as teams learned to defend it better, recognize it, and stop it once and for all. It began to fall into the realm of the trick play. And actually, part of that downfall had to do with what happened next. It's time in the NFL. The first instances of the Wildcat in the NFL would actually date all the way back to its explosion at Kansas State in 1998. The Minnesota Vikings offensive coordinator, Brian Billick, would have Randall Cunningham flex out wide, and on third down, bring in David Palmer, of course the legendary Wildcat specialist from Alabama, and run the plays. And hopefully they would work, and a lot of times they did. In the NFC Championship of that year, when the 15-1 Vikings took on the 14-2 Atlanta Falcons, the Atlanta Falcons would end up using this play against them on a certain drive. Quarterback Chris Chandler on a 2nd and 5 flexed out wide, and wide receiver Tim Dwight took the snap and rushed for 20 yards. In 2006, during a game between the Panthers and Falcons, the Wildcat would see a lot of use once more. The Panthers, under head coach John Fox and offensive coordinator Dan Henning, they needed some way to keep their offense afloat. They had lost 4 games straight up to that point, and starting quarterback Jake Delhomme was hurt. Their backup, Chris Weinke, was also hurt, but he still had enough juice in the tank to start that day, and they knew that they needed to keep his snaps to a minimum so he didn't get hurt even more. The Panthers, though, had a great advantage in their backfield. 2 very, very talented runners, D'Angelo Williams and Deshaun Foster. The Panthers would actually deploy many formations where they had no quarterback on the field, or their third-string quarterback Brett Bonaces lined up as a receiver. In the actual game, the Panthers ran the ball 52 times for 183 yards. They would call Wildcat plays 8 times on third down, and D'Angelo Williams converted on 7 of them in the 10-3 slugfest of a game. They would go on to pass the ball only 7 times that game. But, though, that would also be critical to another explosion of the Wildcat in the NFL, and what I consider to be its peak in the NFL. And we're going to get to that because that is a game that I just love so much. It's a great story, and it's a great use of the Wildcat, and they had no idea it was coming. So, without any further ado, let's get into the 2008 Dolphins. The Dolphins in 2008 were a team with absolutely nothing to lose. The last season, they had been bad. How bad, you may ask? 1-15 kind of bad. I'd say that's pretty bad. They then cleaned house of all of their coaches, except for Steve Hoffman, their assistant special teams coordinator, and George Edwards, their linebackers coach. Their new head coach would be Tony Sparano, and their new offensive coordinator would be Dan Henning. Remember from 5 minutes ago? I hope you do. And their new quarterbacks coach would be David Lee. And David Lee was the offensive coordinator of Arkansas in 2007. We'd already just gone over Dan Henning's experience with the Wildcat. So, let's just say the tea leaves were read very favorably. The Dolphins also had the advantage that a lot of Wildcat teams have, or rather disadvantage, of having a not-so-great quarterback. That would be Chad Pennington. He was coming off of a season where he only played 9 games due to injury for the Jets. The Dolphins, to also work with their Wildcat ways, also had two very, very talented running backs, Ricky Williams and Ronnie Brown. The coaching staff, in fact, wanted to play both of them simultaneously because of how good both of them were in practices. This is just the perfect storm for a Wildcat, okay? You've got the bad quarterback, you've got the OCs with experience, and you've got two very, very good running backs that you want to play. See where this is headed? Of course you do. You probably already know this story. It would take a lot of convincing, though, for David Lee to get some of the Wildcat installed in the offense. Sperano was very opposed to it, and the times they tried to run it in practice were mostly duds, so a lot of the players were opposed to it as well. In an interview with ESPN, Ricky Williams said one day that Lee drew up a Wildcat play on the board in the meeting room. The other players looked at each other, and some of them indeed said, "We're not doing this high school shit," quote. The Dolphins would then start that season 0-2. Then, week 3, they would play the New England Patriots. You know, those guys? Yeah. This wasn't just any New England team, though. This was a team that the year prior had gone 16-0. But they were down their most important piece, quarterback Tom Brady. Matt Castle would get the start, as Brady had torn his ACL and would be out for the entire year. But this was still a team that over the last 3 seasons had won 21 straight regular season games. Even without Brady, their offense was still incredibly potent, and their defense was still fearsome as a New England defense would ever be. Miami, who had one season before had gone 1-15 and started this season on an 0-2 slide and had trouble ripping off big plays in those 2 games. Their offense had been sluggish. They had nothing to lose, nothing at all. So Sperano gave the green light to run some Wildcat. Ronnie Brown would be the quarterback for their Wildcat plays. Ronnie Brown would then go on to have 132 combined yards and 5 total touchdowns in the game. 4 rushing touchdowns and 1 passing touchdown in just 6 snaps from the Wildcat formation. Brown would gain 118 of those yards and 4 of those touchdowns on those Wildcat plays, including a 62-yard run and a passing touchdown. The Patriots were stumped and absolutely routed to a 38-13 Miami victory. The Dolphins marched right into their house and punched them in the face with some high school shit. The plan had actually stumped the Patriots, who were caught in the trap of overthinking in the ways of trying to stop the Wildcat. Their defensive line would slide out of position, linebackers would crash in hard off the edge, only to find Brown was going up the gut in those plays, and around halfway through the game, Pat safety Rodney Harrison began to figure it out, He began to calm down New England's defense as he was the leader amongst them, reminding them that they had checks to revert to when all hell was breaking loose defensively. They could do this. They could still pull this off. And then Ronnie Brown threw a touchdown pass. The Dolphins went up 28-6, and all the air was let out of the New England defense. They had no idea what to do, which was strange, as it would be with any Belichickian defense and their crazy amounts of preparation. This is one of those few moments in NFL history where we could legitimately say Belichick got stumped. It's crazy to think of, but he kind of did. Mike Vrabel was quoted as saying on the sidelines, "Play real football," as they ran one of their Wildcat plays. I just found that funny, and funny with the implications that it would have with Mike Vrabel's coaching career, and of course Derrick Henry's famous Wildcat antics last year. But either way, let's get out of that rabbit hole and go back to it. The Dolphins that year would go 11-5 and win the AFC East, but the Wildcat had run its course about halfway through that season. But still, they managed to pull off the greatest single-season turnaround in NFL history, going from 1-15 to 11-5, and then they would go on to make the playoffs and lose badly in the wild card to the Ravens. Yeah, the Ravens figured it out, stopped them, and punched them in the face, essentially. The Wildcat had run its course, but the Dolphins didn't know it. They saw all that success it had and tried to double down on it in 2008, selecting hyper-athletic West Virginia quarterback Pat White in the draft. But that experiment was a failure. Defenses had learned, they had adjusted, and the Wildcat then fell into the realm of the trick play. But it's not dead, and it will probably never die. Think of some of the greatest trick plays that have been run over the past few years. The Philly Special, does that ring a bell? Derrick Henry's touchdown pass, those were Wildcat plays. And like almost anything in football, the Wildcat will have its place. Be it as a gimmick, be it as the final act of a quarterback desperate team, it doesn't matter. It will still have its place, and it will still be run, and I'm all here for it. I love me some Wildcat, and I'm going to love me some Wildcat for a long time to come. I'd like to thank you all for watching this. If you did, like and subscribe and all that good stuff. I am planning on actually doing a lot of these if you like them. Constructive criticism is appreciated, and yeah, that's about it. I hope I see a lot of you around for next time, because please.